She begged him to listen.
Please. He's your child too.
Her voice trembled, but his eyes were cold, colder than the marble floors beneath her feet. "End it," he said. "You know your place." That night the house was silent, except for her sobs echoing through the servants' quarters. No one knew what she decided or what she lost. 20 years later, that same man would open his door to a stranger, a young man with eyes that mirrored his own. And what happened next would tear apart everything he thought he knew about power, race, and love. So, what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried? Before we dive in, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Let me know in the comments. For 20 years, Richard Wallace lived behind white walls and tighter secrets. He was the kind of man who never looked back, only forward. A respected businessman in Georgia, known for his wealth, charm, and spotless reputation. To everyone else, Richard had it all: a beautiful mansion, a perfect wife, and a legacy his family would be proud of. But the people who worked for him, they saw a different side, especially Grace, his maid. A quiet black woman who kept her head down, her voice soft, her movements careful. She had worked in that house since she was 17. To her, every polished floor and folded curtain carried a story, some painful, some secret. Richard's wife, Margaret, often complained, "These people are lucky we even give them work." Grace would just nod, forcing a smile. "Yes, ma'am," she'd whisper, even as her chest burned with the words she could never say. No one noticed the way Richard's gaze lingered when she passed. No one heard the late-night footsteps, the soft cries muffled behind closed doors. Grace learned long ago that silence was her only protection, until the day she discovered she was pregnant. Standing alone in the servants' bathroom, her trembling hands held the test. She whispered to herself, "Lord, what am I going to do?" For days she avoided Richard's eyes. But when she finally told him, his face hardened. His voice cut through the air like a blade. "Get rid of it, Grace, you understand? That child can't exist." And that was the moment, quiet, cruel, and final, that set everything in motion. Because secrets like that don't die quietly. They wait, watching, growing, until one day the truth comes knocking on your door. Grace didn't sleep that night. The words, "Get rid of it," echoed through her mind like a curse. She sat by the small window of her quarters, clutching her stomach as if her hands alone could protect what was inside. The next morning she tried to talk to him again. "Mr. Wallace, please. I can't," he cut her off sharply. "You don't get to can't, Grace. You will. I have a wife, a reputation. You think I'm going to lose everything for you?" Her lips trembled. "It's not just about you, sir. This is a child." He slammed his hand against the table. "It's a mistake. Fix it." From that moment, the air in that house changed. Margaret noticed Grace's pale face, the way she avoided eye contact. "Is she sick again?" she asked Richard one night at dinner. He didn't look up from his plate. "Probably lazy," he muttered. But Margaret wasn't stupid. One afternoon, she followed Grace to the back garden and saw her kneeling, crying into her hands. Later she found the hidden letter, a clinic address scribbled in shaky handwriting. That evening, the house erupted. "You filthy liar!" Margaret's voice tore through the halls. "You touched her?" Grace tried to speak, but Margaret raised her hand. "Get out! Get out of my house!" Richard's face was pale with fury and shame. "Grace," he hissed, "if you say one word to anyone, I'll make sure you never find work again. You hear me?" Grace nodded, her eyes glistening. She left that night, clutching nothing but a small suitcase and the fragile hope that her baby might survive. Months passed. She gave birth alone in a small town hours away, naming her son Isaiah. Her life became a struggle, cleaning, sewing, anything to keep food on the table. Yet every time she looked into Isaiah's deep grey eyes, she saw Richard's face staring back. Meanwhile, Richard's life went on untouched. The scandal was buried, and he built an empire. New contracts, new homes, new headlines, calling him a man of vision. But no matter how much money he made, the past never truly left him. Sometimes he thought he saw Grace's face in the crowd. Sometimes, in the still of night, he heard her voice whisper, "You'll face what you've done." Isaiah grew into a bright young man, sharp, ambitious, and painfully aware of how the world saw him. At school, teachers questioned how a boy so brilliant could come from a woman like her. He'd come home with bruised knuckles, and Grace would sigh, "Baby, don't let hate change you." But hate had already taken root, just not in him, in the world around him. At 17, Isaiah received a scholarship to a top university, the same one funded by Richard Wallace's foundation. Grace's heart froze when she read the name. "Isaiah," she whispered, "promise me you'll stay away from that man." "Why, Mama?" he asked. "Do you know him?" Her silence told him everything. That night, Isaiah sat alone, staring at his reflection. "The man who destroyed my mother's life built his fortune on her pain." He clenched his fists. "He'll know who I am." And so, 20 years after the night Grace walked out of that mansion, another knock would soon echo through Richard Wallace's door. A young man stood on the porch, his mother's courage in his eyes and his father's blood in his veins. He rang the bell. And inside, a secret 2 decades old began to unravel. The heavy oak door creaked open. Richard Wallace, older now, with silver hair and tired eyes, stood in the doorway. At first he saw only a stranger, a young black man, well-dressed, confident, standing tall against the wind. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, his voice sharp, impatient. The young man smiled faintly. "You don't remember me, do you?" Richard frowned. "Should I?" The young man's gaze didn't waver. "My name's Isaiah. Isaiah Grace." The world seemed to tilt. Richard's breath caught. That name, Grace. His fingers tightened on the doorframe. "Grace, as in my mother," Isaiah said softly. "You remember her?" Silence. A silence so deep it roared in Richard's ears. He stepped back, shaking his head. "No, that's impossible. She left." "She left," Isaiah interrupted, his voice trembling with fury and heartbreak, "because you made her." Richard tried to speak, but Isaiah's words came like blows. "You ruined her life. You used her, threw her away like she was nothing. She raised me alone, worked her fingers raw while you sat in your mansion pretending you were a good man." Richard's face paled. "I didn't know." "You knew," Isaiah snapped. "You just didn't care." The weight of 20 years crashed down between them. For the first time in his life, Richard saw his reflection, not in mirrors or newspapers, but in the eyes of the son he denied. Isaiah stepped closer, tears burning in his eyes. "You ordered her to end me, but here I am, standing on your porch, breathing proof that your hate didn't win." Richard's lips trembled. "What do you want from me?" Isaiah's voice cracked. "I want you to see what you tried to erase." For a moment they just stared at each other. 2 generations, one born in privilege, one in pain, both chained to the same sin. Then Isaiah whispered, "She's gone now. Cancer took her last year. She forgave you before she died." "But I'm not sure I can." Richard's knees gave way. He sank to the floor, gasping as if the truth itself had stolen his air. Isaiah turned to leave. Behind him, Richard's voice broke in a whisper. "Wait, son." Isaiah paused at the door but didn't look back. The silence said everything, and for the first time, Richard Wallace was truly alone. The next morning, the mansion felt colder than ever. Richard sat by the window where Grace once used to polish the glass. The same sunlight poured through, but it no longer felt warm. On the table beside him lay an old photograph he'd found in Isaiah's file. Grace, holding a newborn, smiling softly despite the worn look in her eyes. For hours he couldn't move. Her forgiveness haunted him more than her pain ever did. "She forgave you," Isaiah had said. Those words cut deeper than any accusation. That week, Richard shut down one of his companies and created a scholarship in Grace's name, the Grace Foundation for Single Mothers of Color. Reporters called it a noble act. But the truth was simpler. Guilt trying to buy peace. Isaiah heard about it months later. Sitting in his small apartment, he whispered to himself, "Mama would have smiled." Yet deep inside, he knew no amount of money or charity could erase the centuries that made stories like theirs possible. Because this wasn't just about one man's cruelty, it was about a system built to make people like Grace invisible. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. Her forgiveness wasn't permission, it was power. And Isaiah carried that power forward, not through anger but through purpose. He became an advocate for domestic workers' rights, telling his mother's story in halls that once shut their doors to voices like hers. Every time he spoke, he ended with the same words. They told her to stay silent. She didn't. She lived. And because of her, so do I. Grace's story may have begun in the shadows of a rich man's home, but it ended as light for thousands of others. So the question now isn't just what Richard Wallace did. It's what we still allow. How many more Graces must be silenced before the world finally listens? If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Leave a comment for Grace. Share her strength. And if you believe voices like hers deserve to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep telling the stories the world tries to forget.